Hey, thanks for clicking on this video. Today we'll be making a serving tray, and it's out of walnut. Here's the pieces that I'll be using here, and let's get started. I started by planing down the smaller strips to 1/4 of an inch thick. The reason I went this thickness is really just to conserve epoxy. It's relatively expensive, and I was trying to use as little as possible. With that done, I moved over to the table saw. I ripped 4 strips at 3/4 of an inch wide. This will make the perimeter around the outside of the tray. Then I trimmed the pieces to length and went ahead and started gluing them down to the surface of the walnut base. This baseboard is about 3/4 of an inch thick. It's a solid piece of walnut, and it's around 12.5 inches wide by 18 inches long. Then I moved back over to the planer again with the cutoff piece from the baseboard. This is another piece of that same walnut, and I'm planing it down to 1/4 of an inch thick, the same thickness as all the perimeter boards that I adhered to the top of the base of the tray. Then I took that piece over to the laser engraver. I decided to use this just because it does such nice work and nice crisp lines. I could have put a template on and traced it out, cut it out on a scroll saw, but it would have been pretty time consuming. The laser just makes easy work out of cutting this. My laser's a little underpowered to cut 1/4 inch thick hardwood, but quite a few passes later it did eventually cut through the entire project. Then I used some CA glue and activator just to center that onto the center of the top of the serving tray, and then started mixing up the epoxy. After I had it all mixed up, I added some blue pigment powder and stirred it some more. Once I had the powder all mixed in, I went ahead and poured it into the top of the board. I don't know what it is, but there's something enjoyable and satisfying about pouring this stuff. I didn't mix quite enough the first time, so I mixed a little more up. I set that aside for a minute and used a torch to release all the bubbles from the surface, and then finished the pour until it was even with the top. After that, I swirled my stir stick around on the surface to give it some swirls, and then torched it one more time to release all the rest of the bubbles, and then it was time to wait. So the next day, the epoxy's all set up, and it looks good. There's no air bubbles, and it's just slightly proud of the surface of the board. So now it's back over to the planer, and we're going to flatten it back out. I don't have the planer hooked up to a dust collection because I use the sawdust for chicken bedding, and I don't want to contaminate it with the epoxy. So I have one of my kids' old pillowcases. It's a handy-dandy epoxy catcher. And then over to the drum sander. This step probably wasn't necessary. I could have just done this with a random orbital sander and been just fine. But since I have it, I figured why not, so I ran it through the drum sander a couple times. After that, I set up the router table with an 1/8 inch roundover bit and ran the board through it just to soften the edges and take the sharp corners off. And now we'll go through that sexy sanding montage that every woodworking video needs to have. Ooh, look at that. Wow, so cool. And now that we've established there might be a little something wrong with me, we're going to go ahead and put some fancy handles on this thing. Because, well, fancy handles are going to make this thing a little more fancy than it already is. So then I marked out the spacing for the holes and made sure I used an awl to mark the center point, and then drilled the holes exactly perfectly right where I wanted them to because, well, an offset handle kind of would mess up the whole project. After that, I countersucked the back side of the hole so that the screws are recessed, and then it was time to get the thing into a nice bath of mineral oil. So I slathered it all up with mineral oil and let it sit for a couple hours. And now through the magic of editing, 2 hours has elapsed in mere seconds, and it's time to unslather the board. After it's all thoroughly wiped down, I go ahead and, well, wipe it down some more. This time with some beeswax and mineral oil mix. All that's left now is to install the fancy handles, and we can call this thing done. And here it is in all its wavy, cool glory. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.